What made you realize it was the right time to relinquish power?
Well, it was not necessarily the right time, because the right time might have been much earlier. But the reality is that, fortunately, by the time that we started to change, there were a number of factors that played into persuading us to bring about the change. Of course, it was partly international sanctions. Secondly, there was the strength of the ANC. They had more representation in more countries around the world than the South African formal government had at that point of time. But I think what was in the end probably the most persuasive factor was the internal conviction that came about amongst the white people, and more particularly amongst the Afrikaner people, that we had to come forward with change, that we could not sustain a situation that was inherently unjust, that was inherently incorrect. And that recognition started to build over a period of time. Unfortunately, it culminated at the right moment by the end of the 1980s, through which we could start the process of change, through which we could start the process of democratization in South Africa. And yeah, it was something that many people amongst our own community, the Afrikaner in particular, resisted. As you will recall, there were many moments where there were huge resistance from within the white community, and particularly the Afrikaner community. But I think the overall conviction of the majority was such that we could go ahead and bring about the change.
A key aspect on the negotiation process was the chemistry developed by the National Party and the ANC's chief negotiators, you and Cyril Ramaphosa. Was that so?
It is certainly true. We did develop a good chemistry between the two of us at the personal level. It was not there necessarily from the beginning, but I think we both had an interest in each other, in the sense that we I think started to develop from a very early stage to like each other. And that developed into respect, and that developed into friendship, and that developed into trust. And I think that factor of trust between the two of us played a major role in helping us to give direction to the process of change in South Africa. The trust also became so strong between us that in the end, well, not only in the end, but through the process, we could start to say to each other, there's not a problem that we can't resolve.
How was it decided to release Mr. Mandela?
By 1989, it was a foregone conclusion that if we wanted to start a process of real negotiations about the future for South Africa between black and white, the ANC had to be unbanned and Mr. Mandela had to be released. That was, in other words, if we didn't do that, that would have impeded any negotiations. We would not have been able to start the process without that. And that was a foregone conclusion amongst the majority of the government at that stage. I would not say all, but at least the vast majority of the government realized that. And of course it couldn't happen because Mr. P.W. Botha was until then the leader, and he was not prepared in his time to make that move. When Mr. de Klerk came and we had the change of leadership, he was prepared on the basis of that conviction to make that move. And you know, it was almost a natural process that we then started to take on. I think what was surprising to many people is that it happened so soon after he became president. Of course, as you will recall, he became president of the country only in September of 1989. And this decision was essentially made in December of 89 by the government. It was only announced on the 2nd of February the next year. But the decision was made at the beginning of December of 1989.
That you would release Mr. Mandela on that day?
Well, it was decided that Mr. de Klerk will announce it by the time of the opening of Parliament the next year.
You decided in December, right?
Yes. And it was kept a secret for 2 months, which is unheard of in political terms.
That's why I get surprised.
It was a very well kept secret for a period of 2 months, at least.
Weren't you afraid of the backlash that decision would provoke on a conservative right wing?
I think, like I said, the majority of National Party support had come to the conclusion that this was inevitable. It was not as if it would have been a surprise to say it's going to happen. So I think it was a conclusion that prevailed in the minds of the majority of the government people and in the minds of the majority of the white people. So
the Mandela that you saw coming into light was the same person you imagined while in prison.
Yes, but I was also more impressed, I think, than what I expected at the same time. I came to see him for the first time in May of 1990 when it was the Grote Skeer summit which we held in Cape Town. And that was the first official meeting between the government and the ANC leadership. Of course, that was 3 months after his release. So I didn't meet him before that moment, but when I had the opportunity then to first meet him, it was one of those moments which I will never forget, simply because of the feeling of authority that he commands, the feeling of leadership that he commands. And it was there, it was his whole presence, was just spreading the message. This man is a leader. He is the kind of person that the whole world expected him to be, but even more.
What is the picture of Mr. Mandela that you keep in your heart after all this process?
I think if I can describe it best, I would say he's a gentleman. He's a real gentleman. He's an old, in terms of my memory, every time I've met with him, every time I've worked with him, I was privileged to serve in his cabinet after the transition in 1994. And he always left with me one impression, and that is he's a real old-style gentleman, a person that I can just aspire to follow in terms of those values that he personified all his time. There are many other things, but if I look at him as a person, I would say he's the kind of person that I would have liked to be my father.
That is quite a strong thing to state.
Well, that is really how it is, and that's why I feel so privileged that I had the opportunity to come close to him, particularly as a white person, as somebody who was coming from the opposite camp, so to speak, person who was coming from the background that supported apartheid in my young days, and to have been able to make that switch, to have to be able to make that transition in my own mind, which I often refer to as a paradigm shift, and then to have the privilege to sit in front of him on many occasions, and to be almost taught by him as a son of this country. That was an amazing experience. It's something that will never pass my mind.
Did it change you that much as a human being?
I think his example contributed undoubtedly to that. But the whole process of change in South Africa, changed all of us that were closely involved. It's inevitable. If I look at where I came from in terms of my own persuasions as a young student, and where I ended up in terms of my own transition, as I said earlier, it was a process of deep enrichment, which I treasure still till this day. I was fortunate enough to make that transition.